Hello, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is a national umbrella social justice nonprofit that mobilizes justice-seeking people of faith to take action on issues of peace, poverty, and people's rights. We are so excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partners, United Methodist for Kairos Response. A few announcements concerning our call today. We really ask that if you please keep your video off and your audio on mute. That will help with our connection, our internet connection. We have a lot of folks on the call, and so this will help ensure that we can hear and see our speakers very well. Our webinars are a place to learn, engage, and be in community together. In order to create an equitable and brave space, we do not tolerate any sort of hate speech. We are also recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. So we hope that you will share that widely and share that with your churches and your friends. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. We will have a time for Q&A with our speakers. And so as questions arise, please share those with us. Our closed captioning is automatically generated. So expect to see some spelling errors and other errors. We apologize in advance for that. Again, we're so glad that you're here. And now we will turn it over to our moderator for today, Jim.
Good morning, I'm Jim Niblink. I'm on the steering committee of United Methodist for Kairos Response. Our organization was founded a little over 10 years ago in response to the Kairos Palestine document that Christians in Palestine put out seeking assistance from around the world from other Christians and other religious groups as they face the continuing oppression, especially in the occupied Palestinian territories. For several months now, United Methodist for Kairos Response, along with other activist organizations around the world, both religious and secular, have been warning of severe consequences should Israel not abandon its plan to forcibly remove Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem to make room for Jewish settlers. Then on Monday, Israeli troops entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy month of Ramadan. It's Islam's third holiest site. They were firing rubber bullets and tear gas and injured hundreds of people. Today, there are reports of an ever-growing number of civilian casualties in Gaza as a result of Israeli airstrikes. And yet, in the US, many news organizations continue to tell Americans a false story about unprovoked attacks on Israeli citizens, or at best, suggest that both sides are somehow equally responsible and equally capable of military action. UMKR condemns these misrepresentations of the truth and calls on all people of faith, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others, to speak out against Israel's policy of racist and violent subjugation of a native people. We pledge to let our leaders know that we stand with the oppressed and that they should too. There will be information placed in the chat box to let you know how to help make this happen. We're fortunate that today's presenters are among our most effective voices of information and protest. Their point of departure will be the findings of a recent report by the Nobel-Prize-winning organization, Human Rights Watch. They are Phyllis Bennis and Philip Farah. Phyllis directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, US wars, and United Nations issues. In 2001, she helped found the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the US and around the world. Phyllis has written and edited 11 books. Among her latest is the just published 7th updated edition of her popular book, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Philip Farah is a co-founder of the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, a founding member of the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace, and a much sought-after speaker and leader who has worked with many Christian activists and denominations. Philip was born and raised in East Jerusalem and immigrated to the US in 1978 at the age of 27. He has lived, studied, and worked in several countries in the Middle East, now works as a natural resources economist in Washington, D.C. After Phyllis and Philip share their insights with us, we will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please use the chat box to post your questions. We ask the chat box not be used for discussions so that the chat is kept free to let folks write their questions. Phyllis will start us off, please.
Thanks very much, Jim. And thank you all for being with us today. We didn't know when we planned this that it was going to be in the middle of this latest sets of Israeli violations. I'd like to thank the Methodist Federation for Social Action and the United Methodist for Kairos Response for putting this together. It's such an important moment for us to be talking about this. You know, I would start with the notion that history is determined by when you start the clock. We've been hearing a lot about how this all started when Hamas rockets were fired at Israel. And of course, we know that that's not when it started, that it started, if we look just at this set of events, it started at the beginning of Ramadan when Palestinian families were for the first time prohibited from carrying out a longstanding tradition in Jerusalem, which is to gather for the iftar meal, the sunset meal after fasting all day during Ramadan, at the steps of the Damascus Gate. And suddenly that was blocked off, and it became a point of tension. And then the police turned loose essentially a massive march of settlers, Israeli settlers, who marched through the Palestinian areas. This is occupied Palestinian Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, shouting death to the Arabs and beating up people as they saw them. So we have to be clear that this was sort of the immediate spot in which the crisis emerged. But before that, of course, we were dealing with months of conflict in Jerusalem over ongoing efforts by the Israeli military and the Israeli police to demolish homes across Jerusalem, and most recently to evict Palestinian families from the homes they had lived in. 3 generations had lived in these homes for more than 60 years in a neighborhood of East Jerusalem known as Sheikh Jarrah. And the settlers were allowed to simply go in and physically remove people. This is now being challenged. And on Monday, it was anticipated that the High Court would make its ruling, as it usually does. It rules in favor of the Israeli settlers, the Jewish settlers, with full discrimination against the Palestinian residents. That decision was put off for a month. But at the end of the day, that also wasn't the beginning of what we're dealing with, because all of this takes place in the context of ongoing settlement expansion, colonialism, apartheid, very much what we're going to be talking about today as we look at the new Human Rights Watch report on apartheid. But just a couple of points on what we're seeing in the ongoing violence that's happening today, particularly in Gaza. This is not about, as Jim sort of implied, this is not about 2 equal sides. You know, this is not about, I don't know, maybe Peru and Ecuador in a border dispute or something like that. This is about an occupied population being assaulted by the illegal occupier. In the context of international law, that's what we have to be looking at. The casualties are overwhelmingly on the Palestinian side. There have been a few Israeli casualties as well, but the people of Gaza are so vulnerable in these situations that Israeli bombings inevitably kill large numbers of civilians, including, so far it's up to 10 children among those who have been killed in this bombing. And I want to point to just 3 parts of why Israel may have chosen this time to launch this kind of an attack. One is for Netanyahu politically. He's, as you all know, he's under indictment for a number of crimes. And as long as he's the prime minister, he can't go to jail. As soon as he's no longer prime minister, he may be sent off to prison. So some of this is aimed at reprising his longstanding claims that he's the only one who can protect Israelis, Israeli Jews in particular, from the potential of attacks from the enemy du jour, whether that be Iran or Hamas. The other 2 points have more to do with Israel strategically than it does with Netanyahu politically. One is that Israel has long asserted a strategy for dealing with Gaza known as mowing the grass. which basically means every few years, they usually say every 4 or 5 years, we need to mow the grass in Gaza, which means another military assault as a way of punishing Hamas and achieving some level of quiet. So there was a report in 2014 by the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, a very elite institution inside Israel, that was called Mowing the Grass in Gaza, and that says Israel is acting in according with mowing the grass and describes it exactly that way. It's a horrific thing to think about, that their plan is over the indefinite future, every few years, we'll just have to have a small war against Gaza to make sure they know their place. The second reason has to do with Gaza as a testing ground for Israeli weapons. And in this situation, there was an interesting article some years ago in the middle of the 2014 Israeli assault on Gaza, when Haaretz, one of the leading daily newspapers in Israel, wrote an article that was called, "For Israeli Arms Makers, Gaza War is a Cash Cow." And here's the opening of that article. It says, quote, "Factories worked around the clock turning out munitions as the army tested their newest systems against a real enemy. Now they are expecting their battle-tested products will win them new customers." And that was exactly what happened then, and it's exactly what happens now. The export of weapons is among the highest earning of any part of the Israeli economy, and they are making the most of it by claiming to other governments that want to buy these weapons, we've tested them and they work great to do whatever it is they're supposed to do. And what are weapons supposed to do? What are armies supposed to do? Kill people and break things. So this is very much a testing ground for those Israeli weapons. The final thing I'll say before I get specifically to the Human Rights Watch report is that the Biden administration came into office claiming that human rights was going to be the centerpiece of their foreign policy. In that context, we have a serious problem. On the one hand, Biden has said very explicitly that foreign policy is not his priority. Now, on one level, that's somewhat understandable. We can say that the challenge of the pandemic and the economic crisis are urgent, they are crisis moments, and they should get most of the attention. But given the role of the United States in the world, the notion that we can simply put aside foreign policy and that'll be fine simply doesn't work, because what it means right now is that putting aside foreign policy, particularly on Israel-Palestine, means that the very extremist positions put in power by the Trump regime remain in power. So moving the embassy illegally from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, declaring Jerusalem as the so-called unified capital just of Jerusalem, saying that settlements are not a violation of international law, that annexation of huge swaths of territory in the West Bank is perfectly okay. These are the positions that were put in place by the Trump administration. And whatever he says about human rights in the abstract, until Biden reverses those policies, his commitment to human rights cannot be taken seriously. So it's in that context that I want to shift gears a little bit to talk more specifically about the new Human Rights Watch report that was issued several weeks ago. Some of you may have had a chance to read through it. It's incredibly long. It's more than 200 pages long. And in my view, it's really not necessary to read the whole thing. The key thing are the findings, because the stories they tell, they're compelling and they're powerful and they're worth reading when you have the time. But it's also true that these are not new findings. These are not new pieces of evidence. Many organizations, both those who have identified Israeli crimes as including the crime of apartheid, like the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, and lots of Palestinian and South African and other activists and analysts have used the understanding of apartheid as the best description of what Israel is doing for 20 years or more. So this is not new. What's new, and the importance of it, is that Human Rights Watch is the most influential human rights organization, certainly in this country and probably in the world. It's the biggest, it has the most access to power. So when an organization that has traditionally been very cautious in their criticisms of Israel, they've made certain criticisms, but they've been very careful, they have not made conclusive judgments, etc. When they change, and they do that, this means a huge change. And it means that it's very difficult for those in power to ignore what they're saying. So the two key findings of this long report are, number one, that Israeli policies maintain the intention of maintaining domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians in all of the territory that Israel controls. That means the 67 borders within Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank, Gaza, and occupied East Jerusalem. The second thing is Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. Those are the two most important findings in this report. Now, there are other things. They talk about discriminatory intent that's designed to maintain what Human Rights Watch calls systematic domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. That's a really powerful description. And it says that that happens in both inside Israel and in the occupied territories, and that that equals the crime of persecution, where it's linked to grave abuses of human rights in the occupied territories. So it rejects the argument that Israeli government actions are only about security. That's the only concern. They go on to say that the Israeli government, quote, grants Jewish Israelis privileges denied to Palestinians and deprives Palestinians of the fundamental rights on account of their being Palestinian. So it's not about security, it's about who they are, that Jews are privileged over Palestinians. And these violations, and this is documented at great length in the report, include issues of land, issues of residency, crucially the right of return, the right of families to be together, the right to return to the country in which they were born and from which they were, or their ancestors were expelled in 1947 and 1948. And crucially, this part about the right of return, the Human Rights Watch in the past has also recognized the right of return in a softer way. But in this context, for the first time, they linked Palestinian refugees with the Palestinians living under military occupation and Palestinians living as second and third class citizens inside Israel as a unified people. So they're saying that this discriminatory intent, this issue of domination, involves all Palestinians, so that Israeli Jews are privileged over all Palestinians, including those that don't even live there. That's a huge, important point. Now, the recommendations are the other crucial part. They have recommendations for Israel, for the United States, for the International Criminal Court, for the United Nations. It's a whole long, long list, and I won't go through all of it. But let me just point to a couple of things. For Israel, and I'll go through this one in more detail, they call on Israel to dismantle all forms of systematic oppression and discrimination that privilege Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinians and that otherwise systematically violate Palestinian rights in order to ensure the dominance of Jewish Israelis, and to end the persecution of Palestinians, including, and here's what they say they have to do, ending discriminatory policies and practices in such realms as citizenship and nationality processes. That one is important because we hear often that Palestinians inside Israel, they're equal because they're citizens, they can vote. And it's true, they can vote, unless they live in Jerusalem, in which case they're not citizens, they're only permanent residents. But if they live elsewhere inside Israel, they are allowed to vote, they're allowed to run for office, and they have representation in the Knesset. But they don't have equal rights because there are nationality rights that are separate. That's what this references to. Citizenship and nationality processes. Some things are not only available to citizens, but they're available only to some citizens, those with Jewish nationality. Judaism is considered a nationality in the Israeli context. So they have to end those practices, including protection of civil rights, freedom of movement, allocation of land and resources, access to water, electricity, and other services, and granting of building permits. So it's a very long range. They call for the repeal of the 2018 nation-state law that expressly stated that only Jews have the right of self-determination inside Israel, and no one else, including other non-Jewish citizens, namely the 20% of Israeli population that happen to be Palestinian. And they call on Israel to recognize and honor the right of return of Palestinians who fled or were expelled in the 1947-1948 war known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, and to enter and live in areas where they or their families live. So it's a huge shift for Human Rights Watch to make these demands on Israel. They go further, they call on the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute individuals regarding the crimes of apartheid and persecution in both Israel and the occupied territories. They call on the United Nations to investigate the systematic discrimination and repression that Israel carries out that's based on group identity in, again, both the occupied territories and inside Israel. And they call for the appointment of a global envoy to identify the steps that nation states, governments, and judicial institutions should take to prosecute the crime of apartheid. They call on governments around the world to impose sanctions, including travel bans and asset freezes on Israel to stop these violations. And they call for conditioning arms sales and military aid on Israel's carrying out actual steps to end these crimes. And they call on governments around the world to charge Israeli officials for these crimes based on the principle of universal jurisdiction.
Okay.
Then they call on corporations. Am I getting close here?
That provoked a question. Do you think there's growing recognition among U.S. elected representatives of human rights violations by the Israelis, or are they blind to it?
They're absolutely not blind to it. They're not always, mostly, they're not willing to move on it, but they know. They mostly know. Now, there has been a huge change, partly because there are some new members of Congress who come in as real champions of Palestinian rights, including one Palestinian, Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, who is a daughter of Palestinian refugees. And I think there are more Palestinian supporters now. There is a bill pending by Representative Betty McCollum, and Betty McCollum also has identified the Israeli actions as apartheid, as have leading faith leaders, including Reverend William Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. So there is a shift underway in Congress, and I think that the fact of that shift is both part of a broader shift in discourse that's been underway in this country for a long time, as is the Human Rights Watch report itself. And I'll end with the understanding that what we're seeing right now is a moment when those 20, 25 more years of the work of Palestinians, like Philip and many others, Palestinian rights organizations, and many others have changed the political discourse in this country at the public level, particularly in the Jewish community and the African-American community. Massive changes underway in those communities. And in the media, which is still problematic, but is way better than it used to be. And very slowly, we're finally getting to the point where there is policy change looking like it might be possible as well. So the changes have been huge, and Human Rights Watch report is both a sign of that growing change and will push that change even further. So I'll stop there and we can go back in questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phyllis. Let's turn to Philip for his insight now.
Did I unmute myself successfully? Yes, I did. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well, everybody?
Yes.
Yes, I hope so. Okay, yes, I want to start by thanking MFSA and UMKR for inviting us and for this wonderful panel and for all the work that you have done and are doing. And I also want to thank Phyllis for her insights. I so fully agree with her. And I'll be touching on some of the same things. Regarding Gaza, it wasn't only a testing ground, not only Gaza, but all of Palestine, not only a testing ground for Israeli weapons, but also for American weapons. And this is really one of the kind of cornerstones of the special relationship. When we visited in 2012 with a group called Eyewitness Palestine, we visited a village which is close to the wall and where they have the separation wall, the apartheid wall, we call it, where they have demonstrations against the wall, which is taking a lot of land from them. They showed us maybe like scores of tear gas canisters that many of which are made in the United States. And they really are like, they use the Palestinians as guinea pigs for these American weapons. Anyway, I also wanted to say that my relationship with UMKR goes a long way back, 2012. In fact, my group, Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, was partly the brainchild of Mark Harrison, who told us that in preparation for the General Conference in 2012, it would be good to hear the voices of Palestinian Christian Americans, and that was one of the motives for us starting this group. I also want to say just a few words about the situation in Jerusalem today. We have been very involved in organizing the protests all around the country, actually, and a petition for what's happening in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, and now Gaza, of course. Actually, UMKR was heavily involved in the leadership of the preparations. We put out a petition. We had an initial target of 10,000 people to sign the petition. The first day the petition went live, we had 8,000 signatures. It's been only a couple of weeks, and now we have over 220,000 signatures from all over the world. We have over 250 organizations endorsing this, also from all over the world, from India, from South Africa, from all over. It's been a great success. So yesterday we had a demonstration. At first, like a week ago when we were preparing for it, we thought that it would be great if we had just a few people in front of the State Department delivering the petition to the Secretary of State Blinken, the petition to stop the forced expulsion of people from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem, and the anticipated demolition of homes, many homes, hundreds of homes in the Silwan neighborhood, which is just immediately south of the dome of the mosque compound, the Aqsa Mosque compound, right there, southern edge of Jerusalem. Mass demolitions that are anticipated, and we thought that we would have only a few people and some photo ops for that demonstration in front of the State Department. We had so many people that we decided on the spot spontaneously to walk down Constitution Avenue, shut down Constitution Avenue. Fortunately, the police were very well behaved. They did not stop us. We stopped traffic. They stopped traffic on Constitution Avenue on one side. There were hundreds and hundreds of us. After, by the way, speeches by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the Palestinian woman, member of Congress, and Representative Carson, and they gave speeches. Other Congress people sent messages of support for us, which were read at the State Department rally, and then we marched all the way to Lafayette Square. It was beyond any expectations we had, the support that we gained. And there have been actions in Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles, Boston, all the major cities, and there are more coming. And I have a special relationship to both neighborhoods. Sheikh Jarrah is actually where I was born. My family lost everything in 1948. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. All of this is really about apartheid, and I love to tell stories. My friends in UMKR know that. So I'm going to be telling some stories, and you judge for yourself whether this is apartheid or not. I was born in Sheikh Jarrah after my family were forced out of their home in West Jerusalem. What became West Jerusalem part of Israel. I was born in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which is now facing mass evictions of Palestinian families. Many of these families, by the way, were refugees from 48 who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 from their towns and villages, became refugees in East Jerusalem, and were given properties in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood by the United Nations Refugee Work Association and the Jordanian government. So that's where I was born. And my family faced terrible hardships for the first few years after, they lost everything after the Nakba of 48. And my mom had to go to work while she had 3 children at the time. So we had to take somebody to help around the house. And it was a survivor of the Deir Yassin, the infamous Deir Yassin massacre, which happened in 1948. And her family, of course, fled Deir Yassin, which was fully ethnically cleansed, and became part of West Jerusalem. And they were living in the Silwan neighborhood, which is now many of the people of Silwan are also refugees from 1948. And now they are facing forced evictions, in fact, home demolitions from. So I'd like the person who is running the show to put up the first photo that I wanted to show you. Okay. Yeah, this is the house. My mom is sitting there with her hands folded on the right side, my right side. And this is my mom's family, very large family, standing in front of the really beautiful house in the Musrara neighborhood. The Musrara neighborhood, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. That's not very far from Sheikh Jarrah, where I mentioned I was born. And of course, they lost this house in 1948. The next photo, please. This was taken 42, by the way, 1942. And this is the house now, the same house from a different angle. And it is under renovation. There are several Jewish families living in this house, as in the rest of the Musrara neighborhood, which was totally ethnically cleansed in 1948. Was a kind of middle class, actually middle class to upper middle class neighborhood. And now, and right after 1948, it was all the homes, the Palestinian homes there, were given to refugees, to Jewish immigrants from North Africa. Now, why was it given to North Africa? This is a fairly, comfortable neighborhood. Why did they give it to the North Africans, who were really treated very, very badly in Israel? They were essentially second-class citizens. When they came into Israel, they were sprayed with DDT because of the racism of European Jews towards them, and they continue to be discriminated against. The Musrara neighborhood was given to Jews from North African countries, basically Arab Jews, really, who spoke Arabic, celebrated weddings with Arabic music and ate Arabic food and had lived in North Africa with their Muslim neighbors, on equal footing. It was because this neighborhood was really right at what became the border between 1948, between Jordan and Israel. And it was a dangerous neighborhood. Europeans didn't want to live there. Plus, the utility services for the Masara neighborhood were out of East Jerusalem. And so the utilities were disrupted. And this house, which my family lived in, and they had a couple of tenants, now became the home of 5 or 6 or even more Jewish families crammed together in tight quarters with inadequate utility services, as I said, and under really extreme conditions. And it became the neighborhood from which emerged the Israeli Pantarim Shahurim, the black Panthers of Israel, who, because of the discrimination against Mizrahi Arab Jews, started this group, to protest the conditions, the miserable conditions that were imposed upon them by the Israeli regime. Just to give you an idea. Okay, now, irony that this neighborhood has, you can go to the next picture. Yes, this is a very good friend of mine, Israeli friend, who was one of the founders of the Pantarim Hashahurim, the Israeli Black Panthers, who were vilified, of course, by the Israeli establishment. He and I, in 2019, co-led a tour of the Masara neighborhood with a group called Eyewitness Palestine. And he explained to us how they grew with terrible unemployment and, like I said, bad utilities, cramped and high crime, etc. And he was one of the founders of the Black Panthers. Now, the irony is now that Musrara neighborhood, from which my family were evicted, the neighborhood where he grew as a young child, coming from North Africa and speaking only Arabic at the time, and some French, I think. Now, the irony is that now this neighborhood is prized neighborhood because it is in the heart of Jerusalem. So there's gentrification taking place. And, the Jews of basically the Arab Jews are being, basically driven out of the neighborhood to make way for, better off people who can afford, and like I showed you earlier, in the earlier photo, the house of that belonged to my family is being renovated to make way for wealthier people, who in the process of gentrification, which of course we are experiencing here in the United States. I wanted to ask you, that's enough of the photos now, thank you. I wanted to ask you if any of you have seen the series Exterminate All the Brutes. Maybe you can write in the chat box. I actually have not, but I heard the director, Raoul Peck, who directed the series, the documentary series, talk about it. And it is really powerful. And there are so many similarities, between what the genocide and the ethnic cleansing that happened in various places around the world, with neocolonialism, with settler colonialism. Apartheid and settler colonialism really go together in Israel. They are the foundation of the Israeli state. And hopefully some of you are familiar with the series, basically detailing a totally different version of American history, which we do not learn, which our children don't learn about in the Disneyfied version of history that they learn in their schools. So you know, the idea is to have maximum land and maximum control over resources with minimum of the native population. It was really, you know, without that genocide, basically, of the native people of the United States, the wealth that was accumulated to start what became the United States of America would not have been possible. And in the exact same way, the success, the great success of the Israeli state would not have taken place had there not been mass eradication of Palestinians. The majority of Palestinians were driven out of what became Israel, and the control of all the buildings, the homes, the farms, the factories were taken over, and were the, so to speak, the seed capital for the development of the Israeli state. And this is going on today in front of us, in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, in Silwan, and so many villages in the south of Hebron, all over the West Bank, where settlers are taking over land and displacing the native people, ghettoizing them, the same way, in a way, that happened in South Africa, in the Bantustans, and what happened to indigenous people in reservations in this country.
All right, well, thank you, Philip. We have dozens of questions, and we'd like to move to those now. One of the first ones has to do with the Human Rights Watch document. Are you optimistic that that global report is going to have much of an impact on the U.S. leaders, bureaucrats, politicians, and so on, as they move forward? Do you think that that document is going to have a positive influence relative to the plight of the Palestinians?
Yes, I do definitely believe that. And I think that, you know, in line with what Phyllis said, the way I see it, you know, there are two kind of polar opposites. You have the establishment of the media, you have the establishment of the governments, and you have the establishment of actually the churches as well, on the one hand, and you have the grassroots on the other hand. And on the grassroots level, we are doing extremely well, as evidenced by the demonstration that I mentioned yesterday. Not only were there hundreds of Palestinians in that demonstration, there were hundreds of, I was stunned by how many young people there were, young people who are not Arab Americans. In fact, quite a few Jews. There were, of course, the Hasidic Jews from New York who come to a lot of these demonstrations. But also there were people wearing yarmulkes who looked like they were, frankly, pretty hip. And so it was a really, really diverse group. But I wanted to say something really quickly, sorry I'm taking too long, about the churches as well. And of course, like there was Rashida Tlaib and Representative Carson with us at the rally on the one hand, and we were shouting slogans at Blinken on the other side of the street. So that's kind of symbolic of that divide. But also in terms of the church, you know, establishment. Frankly, somebody sent me the Pope's statement. The Pope gave a sermon at St. Peter's Church in the Vatican, and I was stunned. In his homily, I guess, or sermon, he said, the two sides ought to come together and work out an agreement. For me, this is absolutely stunning, It's like asking the wolf and the sheep to come to some kind of agreement. And, you know, and there again, you know, the juxtaposition between what UMKR are doing, what UMKR does, and all our friends in the pins, whom we appreciate greatly, and then the really tepid statements that come from church leaders. I just wanted to throw that out. Thank you.
If I can just add a quick point to what Philip was just saying, which is really important. I think that the Human Rights Watch report by itself doesn't change anything, but it adds to the pool of information and positions that increasingly are hard to ignore by people in power. You know, it was almost 20 years ago that Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, one of the great heroes of the world, spoke of Israeli apartheid. And it was shunted aside that this is a great man, but we're not going to talk about that part. That was not so difficult. It became harder and harder to do that as mainstream churches begin to criticize Israel and to call for boycotts and divestment processes away from companies who profit from occupation. And what we're seeing is that this is part of this broader shift in discourse around the country, so that when you have church leaders like Reverend Barber saying that this is apartheid, when you have Congresswoman Betty McCollum saying this is apartheid, that becomes much harder to ignore. It's not the one thing that changes it, but this is a really big one. This is much bigger than one church leader changing their mind or one small solidarity organization forming somewhere. All of those things are important. They are all part of this stream of changing language, changing discourse, crucially changing understanding. But when an organization as powerful as Human Rights Watch, that has been known for being reluctant to criticize Israel very harshly, that's what makes it so important. It's precisely who they are. It's not that what they said is so new and different. It's that who was saying it makes it so important.
Good, thank you both. What do you think that supporters of the Palestinian cause here in the U.S. might prioritize in terms of our efforts? Where would we have the most influence at this point?
You know, at the very beginning when I spoke, I talked about understanding that history is determined by when you start the clock. The question of what's your priority is also determined by when. If you're talking about what do we need to do today, it's about stopping this horrific assault on Gaza. So the ways to do that are myriad. Philip spoke about the one really big petition that a lot of organizations were involved with collecting signatures. That's being, I think it was delivered yesterday. There's another one that has another, I think, 100,000 or so signatures that's being delivered tomorrow. So there's a lot of signatures for petitions. That's one thing. Another thing is within your existing organizations, you know, not only the organizations that work on Palestinian rights specifically, like the Kairos response, but all your organizations, whether it's the PTA at your child's school or your church congregation, in all of those arenas, raising the question of Palestinian rights in the context, and this is an important one because it's not just asking people who are facing really serious challenges in their own lives. They may have family members who are ill with COVID. They may have lost their job during the pandemic. All of these things are very real. And it's in a certain way a luxury to ask people to take into account what's going on around the world. That's very real. That's not just, it's not a moral failing to not be able to do that. We have to be sympathetic to that. And we have to recognize that the particularity of this international issue is precisely that it's our tax dollars. Where could that $3.8 billion a year be better used? Could it be better used in providing vaccines for more people around the world? Could it be better used for a Green New Deal here in the United States? Is that how we can start paying for Medicare for all, by taking away that $3.8 billion that goes directly to the Israeli military? So there's something very directly connected for all of us. So I would say that the most important thing is everything you can do right now. sign every petition that you see, go to every protest that you hear about, and talk to everyone in your circles, in your family, in your school, at your job, in your church, at your mosque, at your synagogue, wherever it is that you're seeing your friends, your colleagues. Talk about it. That's what changing the discourse means. The reason that the organizations that I work with, Jewish Voice for Peace, is on the rise, it's grown so much. It's now something like 20,000 paid members and a couple of 100,000 supporters online. We have a rabbinical council of, I don't know, 50 or 60 rabbis. You know, the reason for that is that this discourse is changing massively, and Jews are part of that discourse shift, turning away from uncritical support for Israel. So all of those things mean talking to everybody you know to change that discourse.
Philip?
Yes, if I may add very quickly, almost any issue that people are working on in the U.S., whether it is, disarmament or the separation, well, the wall on the Mexican border, Elbit Systems, an Israeli company that is involved in the apartheid wall in Palestine, and which is a big international military supplier all over the world, is one of the companies that was involved in building the Trump's wall with Mexico. If we're talking about prisons, the prison industrial complex, companies that private companies that run prisons in the U.S. also are involved in profiteering from the imprisonment of Palestinians in Palestine, in Israeli prisons. Almost any issue that you can think of course, the aid, the 3.8 billion that Phyllis mentioned, it's money that comes out of, the hide of the taxpayer and could be going to more to better things. But I also wanted to say that, for the churches, the work that the PINs, including UMKR, the Palestine-Israel networks of the different denominations, including UMKR, what they are doing is so essential. I mean, many of denominations have facilities, have support hospitals in Palestine, support vocational training centers, etc., educational institutions. They know what is happening. They see it with their own eyes, and they see that the Palestinian Christian, if they don't care for the general Palestinian population, do they at least care for the Palestinian Christian presence in Palestine? Apparently not. The churches are becoming places like museums. What has been called the living stones, are no longer living. They're on their way to becoming simply museums for Western tourists, enjoying themselves, and maybe they go to the disco, an Israeli disco one night, and then the next day they go to visit one of the old churches like the Holy Sepulchre. Is that what our church leaders in the U.S. around the world want? I know that's a parochial view of it, but at least appeal to that. Support the Palestinian Christians who are totally disappearing from Palestine.
All right. Another question. I know you share the frustration of many of us at the false narrative that many in the U.S. news media present to our public about the entire situation, let alone the specifics of what's going on this week. What do you think are the most effective ways that we can use to counter that false narrative?
I think that the question of the media is a very important one. It's also important to recognize that the media has changed dramatically in recent years, so that it's no longer simply repeating the words of the pro-Israel lobbies. whether the Christian lobbies like CUFI, the Christians United for Israel, or AIPAC, the longstanding Jewish supporters of Israel, they're not taking that at face value anymore. It's changed dramatically. You see Palestinian voices in the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Washington Posts, and quoted extensively on NPR and in all the news shows. So all of that it's just not what it used to be. That's the first thing, is recognizing that change. I think sometimes in our movement, we get caught up in this sense that the media is the problem, because it has been for a long time, and it still isn't great, but it's way better than it used to be. So it means taking all that seriously. There was an extraordinary op-ed in the Washington Post 2 or 3 days ago by my friend Noura Erakat, along with Mariam Barghouti, a Palestinian analyst in Ramallah, that talked about apartheid and talked about settler colonialism. And there it was, like normal on the op-ed pages of the Washington Post. This is normal now. So we have to recognize that, engage with it, write letters to the editor, thanking them for running it and commenting on it, as well as writing all the letters when they run bad stuff, which is still very frequent. You know, it's recognizing that things have changed on the media level. It means supporting independent media, whether it's Pacifica Radio, Democracy Now!, magazines like The Nation, websites like 972 or Mondoweiss, whatever. All these alternative sources are important, and recognizing that we can have this kind of influence on the mainstream media as well. One of the things that we saw for the first time in the Israeli assault on Gaza in 2008 and 9, Operation Cast Lead, one of the first things Israel tried to do was keep out the international press, because they knew what the consequences would be if people saw the consequences, the results of what they were doing. It turned out that for the first time, they were unable to do that. Not for lack of trying, but because social media was already a thing. It wasn't what it is today, but it was huge. And people across Gaza had computers and had cell phones, so that when the electricity came back on for an hour, which it didn't very often, but it did occasionally, the first thing people would do would be to power up their cell phones so they could send their video out into the world. Israel couldn't stop that. They couldn't stop the New York Times from having front page articles throughout that crisis written from inside Gaza under the bombs. Why? Because they had an ongoing full-time stringer for the New York Times, who had been working for them for 2 years, who happened to have been born and raised in Gaza and still lived there with her family. So they weren't able to prevent that sort of thing. So the goal of media suppression these days, in the era of social media and of online resources, simply isn't there as much anymore.
Yeah. Thank you, Phyllis. Philip, comment on that? You're muted.
Yes, I think Phyllis covered it very well, but do please support alternative media like Democracy Now! And if you have some giving to spare, include outlets like Democracy Now! In your giving, and by all means, I think we have to be strategic about this. There's a very good group called Right with an exclamation mark. If you get in touch with me, please put my email in the chat box. That's fine. I'll connect you with them. Strategic in the sense of targeting media outlets like PBS Nightly News, is it? Which is fairly decent on many issues, but not at all on Palestine. But definitely also do write letters thanking outlets, even mainstream outlets like the Washington Post and NPR occasionally, unfortunately, for the good coverage that they give.
Thank you. We have come to the top of the hour, and we have committed to limit our discussion to the 1 hour. I'm going to suggest that we have one more question, and that will take us to about 10 minutes after the hour, and then we'll bring the webinar to an end. The last question then has to do with BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. What is your perspective on the momentum that it has right now, and how we might counter the anti-BDS movement that seems to be sweeping across state legislatures, especially in the U.S.?
Philip, do you want to go first, or?
Please go ahead, Phyllis.
Okay. Well, I think that BDS has been a very important and remains a very important strategic approach to building a strategy of bringing nonviolent economic pressure to bear on Israel to stop its violations of international law. It's not the only strategy. It doesn't, for example, in this country deal, although you can make the argument, but it's a bit strained, it doesn't deal with the urgent necessity of focusing on the question of US military aid to Israel. The congressional work that's going on to support, for example, Congresswoman Betty McCollum's bills, which is HR 2590. Support for that bill, 2590, is very, very important. It calls for imposing end-use restrictions on the military aid. It doesn't call for cutting the aid, but it says that the aid may not be used for Israel's system of military juvenile detention. Israel is the only country in the world that has a juvenile detention system within the military, where children as young as 12 are routinely arrested, often at 2 o'clock in the morning, held and interrogated away from their parents, taken inside Israel, out of the occupied territories, made to forced to sign confessions in a language they don't speak. It's a horrific reality. And so this is designed to prevent US funds from being used for that program and to prevent US funds from being used for the demolition of families' homes where children live. The work that the Defense of Children International and UNICEF has been extraordinary on these questions. So that campaign is very important. So I think the key thing is to recognize the importance of the BDS movement. It also represents the broadest combination of Palestinians. The original call in 2005 came from 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, everything from trade unions, women's organizations, youth groups, religious groups, political factions. Everybody signed on to it. And as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Philip, I think it's the only strategic call that has ever had that breadth of support from every Palestinian side in the occupied territories, in the refugee camps, inside Israel, pretty much everywhere. And it's the reason I think that we're seeing such a harsh crackdown, particularly on students who are more vulnerable, and academics, both teachers and students. They're vulnerable, and so they're the subject of attack because the BDS campaigns are working. It's creating enormous educational possibilities for people to learn about what Israeli practices, whether you call it apartheid or you call it occupation. People are learning about what it represents. The irony is, of course, that the targets of those campaigns on college campuses, there's a lot of campaigning, for instance, against Sabra hummus. It's an Israeli company that makes a particular brand of hummus. And it's a great campaign for educating people about what Israeli policies mean for Palestinian lives. It hasn't had a real impact on the Israeli economy, and it's not going to, frankly. But that's not the only reason for doing a BDS campaign. The irony is that there are BDS campaigns that are having a real impact on the Israeli economy, and they're largely the ones carried out by the churches, who control, among other things, enormous retirement funds, millions of dollars in investments. And when those investments are made to have social responsibility requirements that prohibit them from investing in companies that profit from occupation, that's serious. So why are the churches not being targeted the way the students are? It's because the students are vulnerable. So I would say that churches who are doing such extraordinary work to build BDS campaigns, whether they use that term or not, boycott campaigns, divestment campaigns within their church structures, should also play some role in helping to defend the students and the professors who are the ones taking the brunt of these anti-BDS attacks across the country.
I have really very little to add. I just want to recognize David Wilder a Methodist friend who I think was calling for BDS, for a BDS approach. I think he is on this call. Before many Palestinians were doing so. And I agree fully about the importance of the work in the churches. I agree with Phyllis. And I think that, you know, like, for example, UMKR, I think probably had one of the very best websites on on which products to boycott. And hopefully it has been updated. I haven't checked it in a while. Please just keep doing what you're doing.
Okay. Well, we thank you both very much. It's been very informative. Thank our audience as well. And we remind you that this webinar has been recorded. You can also download and save the chat room if you want to. We'll have this posted for review within the next week or so. And I want to again thank the presenters, Philip and Phyllis, and everyone who attended. We'll turn it back over to Bridget Cabrera now for MFSA. Thank you. Well, I don't hear Bridget, but what we traditionally do now is thank everybody for coming, as I've done, and we'll leave the webinar open for several minutes now. If you would like to just simply exchange greetings with each other, feel free to unmute yourself and turn your cameras back on, and you'll be able to see some of the folks who are here. We had about 160 in attendance, and so we'll be around for a few more minutes just to chat with each other and share amongst ourselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. I do have one quick announcement. I couldn't get myself off mute quick enough, and I couldn't. There's so many people on this call that I couldn't find myself to put me back on the thing. But if you live in Chicago, or if you know folks that live in Chicago, there is going to be a rally today at 4 p.m. Central Time, hosted by the Chicago Coalition for Justice and Palestine. I'm going to put this in the chat, and so feel free to share this with folks you might know. Oh, I see Alka has shared some things, so thank you, Alka. And Alka, if you want to say a few things when we all socialize, you can do that as well. So thank you, everyone, for being